Make a statement regarding the return of students to universities. Throughout this pandemic, our priority has always been to keep young people as safe as possible while they continue to learn. It is this commitment to learning and skills that has led the Prime Minister to announce today that through our Lifetime Skills Guarantee, we will upgrade further education colleges across the country with huge capital investment. We'll expand the apprenticeship offer, we'll fund valuable free technical courses for adults equivalent to A-level, and extend our digital boot camps. We'll expand and transform the funding system so it is easy for a student to get a loan for a higher technical course, as easy for that as it is for a university degree. The government will give everyone a flexible lifelong loan entitlement to 4 years of post-18 education, so adults will be able to retrain with high-level technical courses instead of being trapped in unemployment. At the beginning of September, we saw the successful reopening of our schools and colleges. Universities have been working just as hard to make campuses as safe as possible, including through enhanced cleaning measures, social distancing on campuses, and changes to timetables to stagger and manage attendance on site. We've now seen the new intake of first-year students who are beginning a new chapter in their lives at university, together with those who are returning to carry on their studies. I know this will not be the start that any of them would have wanted or expected, and I'd just like to say that I'm pleased to see both universities and students have followed the guidance in a responsible way, putting themselves, their friends and the local community in a safe place and out of harm's way. Students, as well as the wider community, accept when we are living in a global pandemic, we have to operate in a society with restrictions. But I do not believe that we should look to inflict stricter measures on students or expect higher standards of students' behaviour from them than we would from any other section of society. There must be a parity. The decision to keep universities open and all of our students learning has been a result of an enormous team effort throughout the university and higher education sector. We have drawn on the expertise of a HE task force that we set up, and we've been providing robust public health advice and regular updates to the sector to help them to plan carefully to keep students and staff as safe as possible. As with all our education settings, we will continue monitoring the situation closely, and we will follow the latest scientific advice, adapting policies as the situation changes. I know there has been some anxiety about the impact safety measures will have on the Christmas holidays. Students are important members of the communities that they choose to study in. We expect them to follow the same guidance as those same local communities. We are going to work with universities to make sure that all students are supported to return home safely and spend Christmas with their loved ones if they choose to do so. In this context, it's essential we put in place measures to ensure this can happen while minimising the risk of transmission. Where there are specific circumstances that warrant it, there may be a requirement for some students to self-isolate at the end of term, and we will be working with the sector to ensure this will be possible, including ending in-person learning early if that is deemed to be necessary. My department will publish this guidance shortly so that every student will be able to spend Christmas with their family. Where students choose to stay in their university accommodation over Christmas, universities should continue making sure they are safe and well looked after. Of course, it is inevitable there will be cases of COVID occurring in universities, just as there are in our wider communities and the constituencies that we represent. But, Mr. Speaker, we believe that universities are very well prepared to handle any outbreaks as they arise, and we have been working with the sector and Public Health England to make sure that they have every support and assistance they need should this happen. I have been impressed by the steps that our universities have been taking, working hand in glove with local authorities and local public health teams to safeguard students and staff. All our universities have local outbreak plans, and all of these have been discussed with local directors of public health. It is essential that we continue to allow our students to have face-to-face teaching wherever possible as part of a blended learning approach. I've heard the opposition call for all learning to move online. While online learning is a highly effective part of the learning experience, there are many courses, including medicine and dentistry, as well as the creative arts, which require a face-to-face element. That's why our guidance, published on the 11th of September, set out a tiered approach in higher education. Tiers enable a balance of face-to-face and online learning within the context of the COVID risk, and will operate alongside local restrictions that are placed on the wider community in the area that the university is in. I would now like to mention the latest position regarding testing for students. We've been working with DHSC to make sure that the testing capacity is sufficient and appropriate for universities, and I'm sure you'll be aware that DHSC has now launched the NHS COVID-19 app. The Department for Health and Social Care continues to make more testing available, and the vast majority of people can get a test locally. DHSC is also increasing the number of local testing sites and laboratories, adding new lighthouse laboratories in Newport and Charnwood to the national lab network, as well as additional walk-in centres being planned. Mr. Speaker, while we know that testing capacity is the highest that it has ever been, we are still seeing a significant demand for tests. So, like any other member of society, it is vitally important that staff and students at universities only get a test if they develop coronavirus symptoms, or if advised to do so by a clinician or a public health official. I'm aware that going to university can be a stressful time for some students, many of whom will be living away from their family and friends for the first time in their lives. This year will undoubtedly see added pressures because of a disruption and uncertainty caused by this global pandemic. And we must be mindful of how this will affect mental health and well-being of students. Many universities have bolstered existing mental health services and offer alternatives to face-to-face consultations. Once again, I'd like to thank staff at universities and colleges who have responded so quickly and creatively to the need to transform these essential services. We have asked universities to provide additional help and practical support to students as well. And I'm pleased to say that, Mr. Speaker, that universities are making sure students that are isolating are properly cared for and can access food, medical and cleaning supplies if needed. Student accommodation and support services will be a vital resource if any student has to isolate, and for students generally during this whole period of the pandemic. As well as providing support for those in halls of residence, we'll make sure students who live in houses of multiple occupation away from campus will still have access to advice and support if they need it. Universities are also able to call on £256 million provided by the government for hardship funding for students who have to isolate. Mr. Speaker, this government has taken a conscious decision to prioritise education. We know how fundamental a good education is to opportunity, to aspiration and to social mobility. That is why we opened schools and why over 99.8% of schools are now open, delivering education to our children. Delivering education and the opportunity to go to university is equally important for those youngsters who have left college or left school as well. We will never be in a position where we can eliminate all risk. But we will not condemn a generation of young people by asking them to put their lives on hold for months or years ahead. We believe that universities are very well prepared to handle any outbreaks as they arise, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadows Secretary of State for Education, Kate.
I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and for advance sight of it. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that after a decade of slashing funding to further education, the Conservatives have recognised that this is an important sector for life chances and for our economy. And I would like to work constructively with the government to get this right. But their continued reliance on loans to fund education and the fact that the funding will not come on stream for many more months as we head for a crisis of unemployment are deeply concerning. Mr. Speaker, the situation as students return to university is desperately worrying. Across the country, many find themselves isolated in cramped accommodation. Parents are worried about their well-being and safety, and university staff who've worked so hard over the summer to prepare are anxious and angry that the government didn't keep its part of the bargain. They've all been let down by the government, just as it let down many of these same students with its handling of exam results last month. What students, staff and their families need now is reassurance. 19 days ago, the last time the Secretary of State commented on the situation at universities, he stressed the importance of delivering clear messages to students, and I hope he'll use the opportunity of answering my questions today to do that. Everybody knew that the return of students to universities would present significant challenges. SAGE warned of the impact weeks ago. What planning was put in place over the summer to ensure students would be able to return safely? Universities have stressed the importance of being able to work closely with local public health teams. So why did it take the Secretary of State and the Health Secretary until last Wednesday to write to local directors of public health about the return of university students? What is his message to those students who haven't yet moved to campus? They need clarity. Should they do so? What urgent steps is he taking to ensure that every student can get the best possible education, whether they're at home or on campus? How many students are currently unable to learn remotely because of a lack of digital access or devices? And what's the Secretary of State doing to address that? And what extra support will be given to students with special educational needs and disabilities? He's right that some courses require face-to-face teaching. But has he considered supporting universities to move all teaching online where this is possible, at least for this first term? For weeks now, Labour have warned the government that they must get a grip on testing and tracing if we're to reduce the spread of the virus, and the failure to do so lies at the root of this situation, and sorting it must be the government's top priority. In his statement, the Secretary of State said that only those with symptoms should try to get a test. That will leave many without symptoms in self-isolation in difficult circumstances. Can he tell us how many students, staff and members of the community around universities have symptoms but are waiting for a test? What is the local testing capacity in each community with a university? And is he confident that there will be sufficient if there's a spike in cases? Some universities have taken the lead where the government has failed and begun to develop their own testing capacity. What support is he offering to those institutions and to others who wish to do this? Mr. Speaker, we can't forget that at the heart of this crisis are thousands of young people, many away from home for the first time, many now isolated with a group of people who are practically strangers. We can only imagine how hard it is for them. The Secretary of State said he's asked universities to provide additional help, but beyond asking, what will his department be doing to help them? I'm glad he's listened to Labour and finally given a straight answer on reuniting students and their families over Christmas, but can he tell us why it took several days and repeated contradictions from his ministerial colleagues to do so? In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the crisis now threatening our universities was predictable, and it was predicted. Today, the Secretary of State failed to outline a plan to get testing fit for purpose, failed to commit that every student who needs access to remote learning will get it, and has no plan to ensure the future of our universities. If he doesn't get a grip, the situation we've seen in recent days could repeat itself across the country. Students will be unable to continue their studies, families will be concerned for their well-beings, and universities will face serious financial difficulties. And the Secretary of State will once again have let young people down as a result of his incompetence.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions. I'm glad that she welcomes the announcements on further education. The changes that we're wanting to drive in further education are absolutely vital in order to ensure that our country is in the right place to seize new opportunities now that we've exited from the European Union, and make sure our youngsters and people of all ages have the skills that they need to drive productivity in this country and ensure that they get the very most out of their lives. The Honourable Lady mentioned about, the advice from SAGE. Understandably, on top of the advice that we had issued on the 2nd of July on the return of universities and higher education institutions, we obviously wanted to update that advice following the conclusions of SAGE, which we did, taking into account the issues that they had raised and some of the suggestions that they had put forward. But also, SAGE warned about the impact of youngsters not going to university, of having that taken away from them, the opportunity to be able to return. And this is something that was recognised across all 4 nations of the United Kingdom, and recognised how important it is for youngsters to be able to go and study at university. The Honourable Lady raised an important point about digital access, and I'm sorry that she had missed the announcement of the fact that we had made £100 million available for universities to be able to use to ensure youngsters have digital access. Some of those students from the most deprived backgrounds that were maybe not in a position to be able to access courses is absolutely vitally important. Where we are in a situation, Mr. Speaker, where people will be having blended learning, that all students are able to access it, and taking very seriously some of the challenges that all students will face and universities face. That's why we have made £256 million available to make sure that where students are facing real hardship, that universities are able to access that funding in order to help them. I'd also like to thank my honourable friend, the Universities Minister, who's been in regular touch just over the last few days, where there has been a small number of universities which have seen a number of coronavirus cases, not uncommon as to what we have seen across communities right across the country, to make sure that they know we are there to support them and to give them any help that is required. But we mustn't forget that hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million students, have safely returned back to university over the last few weeks, and they will be able to start their studies and able to benefit from a brilliant world-class university education.
Lee. The Secretary of State confirmed that a proportionate response means this, that students have a right to their course and to face-to-face education, and all of us must take personal responsibility, including older people like myself. We cannot destroy the life chances of the young. If you're doing a history degree, you cannot be condemned to permanent online teaching. You might as well sit at home. Why have you paid all this money? And Willie confirmed that, of course, students, if they get ill, must self-isolate, but we cannot have these scenes of whole halls of residence being locked down. This is not the sort of university that we all want, a place of light and learning, not enforced lockdowns.
Mr. Speaker, we'd expect students to follow the same rules as we ask everyone within society to follow. Those who have been tested positive for COVID and those who have been in close contact, we'd understandably ask them to self-isolate. Universities are working very closely with local public health teams to ensure that that happens, but we always want to ensure there's a sensible and proportionate response to ensure that students are able to go about their business, continue on their learning, both online, but also importantly face-to-face as well.
We now head to Scotland with Cyril Monaghan, the SNP spokesperson. Cyril Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to start by declaring an interest. My son is currently at university, having to deal with online lessons, and my husband teaches in the university. But unfortunately, COVID is only one of the challenges currently facing universities, with a hard Brexit fast approaching. But I'd like to start by joining the Secretary of State in praising the steps that have been put in place by universities to keep staff and students safe, with both blended and online lessons and with mental health support. And I hope the Secretary of State will join me in recognising the support that has been given by individual universities, such as Glasgow, who will refund 1 month's rent for any student having to self-isolate in halls, and Dundee University, who are offering free accommodation to international students who are having to quarantine. But students and young people should not be blamed for the rise in cases. The vast majority are complying entirely with the guidance. But while Scottish students attend university in Scotland for free and therefore are not financially impacted by fees, students in England will pay over £9,000 for mostly an online education. This is clearly the time to reflect on the fee-paying structure of higher education and consider following Scotland's example of free higher education for all. So what discussions has he had with Cabinet colleagues on reducing fees and increasing the government funding to universities? Now, we know there have been issues in accessing tests in England, and this can become more acute for students who may not have the ability to travel to testing centres. So what steps is he taking to set up on-campus tests for students? Finally, in the Science and Technology Select Committee earlier this month, the Principal of Glasgow University, Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli, described the R&D roadmap published by the government in July as a very high-level document that needed to be turned into a definitive plan very quickly, with clarity given on the government's exact plans for investment. Could the Secretary of State set out when details will be released on this roadmap?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her many comments, and I know that both the University of Glasgow and Glasgow Caledonian, both neighbouring universities to her constituency, have been doing an awful lot of work welcoming students from all four parts of the United Kingdom and demonstrating how important the United Kingdom is for these all universities to be able to succeed in terms of a collaboration that we do across the board. I do thank her for putting forward policy suggestions for future Conservative Party manifestos. We want to ensure that actually universities are are properly funded so that they're able to have world-class facilities that are able to beat any universities, any place in the world. And I know there's also universities in Scotland also benefit from the UK finance system, as do Scottish students as well. In terms of test and trace, we continue to work closely.
Order. To the Secretary of State might be helpful. The questions are meant to come through me. Addressing the SNP Chief Whip isn't quite where we need to be. But please, if we can make sure that we are coming through the chair.
I do apologise, Mr. Speaker. I'd spent so long with the SNP Chief Whip. When we're Chief Whips together, I naturally gravitate to him and have a lovely conversation with him. And that was old habits die hard, Mr. Speaker. So I apologise about that. But, Mr. Speaker, and ignore the Honourable Member for Glasgow. But, Mr. Speaker, at every stage in terms of working with universities is recognising that we are dealing with a fluid situation. We're working with test and trace to make sure that there is availability for all students to be able to access testing at universities as close to where they're resident. I think that's it.
Raritan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know locally Keele University and Staffordshire University have been working extremely hard during the pandemic to support students. So would my right honourable friend agree that despite the current challenges we face, everything possible must be done to ensure students get as enriching an experience as possible this year?
Well, I'd like to pay tribute to those two great universities from Staffordshire, both the University of Staffordshire and the University of Keele, for all they've done to make sure that they give a warm welcome to all students, making sure that they are able to progress with their life chances and have the opportunity to learn, as what we want to see all youngsters to have that opportunity in all four nations of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What we have seen this week on two halls of residence in Manchester, in my constituency, I'm afraid just about sums up everything that the government is getting wrong in handling this crisis. No planning over the summer and foresight. It was obvious that halls of residence would be the main area of risk. Confused messages that his own ministers can't even keep a track of, let alone 18-year-olds all arriving in our city from different parts of the country, and a woeful lack of quick testing which could have avoided this situation. So when is his government going to get a grip, especially of the testing regime, so that others don't have to face restrictions because he's lost control?
Well, the Honourable Lady is probably aware that we're doing more tests a day than ever been done before, 225,000 tests every single day, increasing the amount of testing capacity to 500,000 by the end of next month, recognising the fact that this has to be targeted into areas of high need, such as the areas that the Honourable Lady's highlighted. But we will be asking, if the Honourable Lady is going to ask questions, she maybe wants to have the opportunity to hear the answer. But what we are asking students to do, we are asking students where they get tested and where there is a positive test for them to self-isolate. And as in the wider community, is those immediate contacts also self-isolate. But we do recognise how important it is for universities to be able to provide the support for those youngsters. And we touched upon it in my statement in terms of food and cleaning products and other support that may be available. And my honourable friend, the Universities Minister, was speaking to the Vice-Chancellor of Manchester Met just yesterday, making it clear the offer of support that we are there standing behind universities, helping them support their students, which is so critical. And I know it's something that both she and I share.
Thank you. No, come to Mark Harper. Sorry.
Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I think has worried a lot of university students is the idea that if they are either test positive or a contact of someone that tests positive, they might have to self-isolate even over Christmas in their university accommodation. I'm glad the Secretary of State confirmed that we'll treat university students like everyone else. In the regulations yesterday,